Chapter 33. An hour before dawn, Rags, Alan, and Sarah climbed to the diving platform, boarded Salty, stowed their supplies, activated their night vision goggles, and were ready for action. Presumably. Sarah wasn't so sure Alan was up to much more than driving the boat. He'd seemed distant while he inspected hers and Rags' suit and gear. At one point, she thought his eyes had crossed. Not a good sign. Not a good sign at all. Of the three, Rags was by far in the best shape. Sarah's eyes might not be crossing, but she still felt like she'd been run over by a truck. Multiple times. The thought of getting into the water, kicking and stretching her arms, made her spine twinge. Swimming, or, let's face it, even running, might be a new level of hell that she'd been lucky to avoid until now. When the Zode's electric engines started, Sarah sat in the jump seat and stretched her arms and back. Rags was doing something quite similar, although hers weren't as deep and didn't elicit the same look of pain. "Don't got much left in the tank, boss," Givens' ghost said. "No, I don't," she agreed. "So save what you can." "Save what I can," she said aloud. Rags looked at her, an unspoken question on her lips. Sarah shook her head and went back to stretching. With the sun still well below the horizon, the clear sky didn't have so much of a hint of purple, let alone orange. Kojo had killed Keko's running lights and drawn her cabin sunshades, and the ship quickly faded into the gloom behind them. If, that was, she wasn't seeing the world in a verdant, fuzzed-out green. With her night vision goggles, there was no reason for any floods. Alan had even killed the Zode's night vision-safe running lights. The darkness made it impossible to see what Alan had termed the portage from this distance. Even with the state-of-the-art night vision goggles, the shoreline and jungle looked like an indecipherable combination of lines and shades. "We're in no hurry," Alan said softly, his voice going out over their comms headsets. "Going to take it slow and quiet." Neither she nor Rags responded. Sarah imagined the Zode must look like a black wraith gliding over the ocean, silent except for the water it disturbed and the mosquito whine of the engines. If anyone at the portage had been tasked to scan the ocean for visitors, they might find the Zode against the gloom, but more than likely no one would notice until Salty was on top of them. Sarah was sure that if Alan opened the throttle, Salty would practically fly toward the enemy. Or away from them. Salty's electric motors whirred down, but the hull continued vibrating, and the wake behind them diminished, but didn't disappear. Now they were about as silent as they could be and still travel at more than a few knots. Sarah turned her head and looked for Keko, but the ship was utterly lost in the dying night. If Sarah couldn't find the boat, she doubted anyone else would either. She zoomed in and focused on the amorphous shapes floating near the portage. The ship was much smaller than Keko, at least in length, but it had once been a working trawler of some kind. The equipment for the nets appeared to have been inexpertly removed and replaced by a platform and nests of ropes. "Probably used to clamp to a ship's gunwale," Sarah thought. "Climb up like pirates of old, or puncture an inflatable boat," she supposed. She wasn't sure what the purpose of that would be, but it still seemed logical. The aft had a rack of AKs in one corner, while another rack held crates crisscrossed with ropes. Sarah guessed their hold wasn't empty. Otherwise, the gear would be below, unless they wanted the weapons and ammo at hand in case a target presented itself. Or maybe because it had. The three boats near the ship were much smaller, little more than long canoes with side-slung diesel outboard motors. From what she could see, which wasn't as much as she liked, no one moved on the ship's deck. Deserted. Alan slowed the Zode, and they floated inland in near silence. "No targets," Rags said. She was scanning the area with a nightscope. "Confirm no targets," Sarah said. The two women kept their voices barely above a whisper. When Alan responded in a calm, commanding voice, Sarah felt a surge of relief. "Getting you close enough to climb aft. I'll need someone to cover." "Sarah, you cover. I'll go up." I'm smaller," Sarah replied. "I have experience." "In the desert," Rags said softly. "This is different. Misjudge and you hit the water if you're lucky. If not, you slam into the hull and break something you can't afford to break. I go." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but stopped before uttering a single word. Rags was right, of course, but that didn't take the sting out of feeling useless on the mission. Finally, she nodded. "I'll cover." "Alan?" Rags said. Soon as I'm aboard, get ready to move in a hurry. He nodded. She's the lookout. I'm the wheelman. Alan rubbed a hand across his forehead, which came away quite moist. Sarah couldn't be sure, but she thought his eyes had crossed for a brief moment. She merely nodded to Rags again. Rags flashed a grin, pulled a jet-black balaclava from her gear bag, and quickly slipped it over her head. Between the black wetsuit, her matte black weapons, and the balaclava, she'd be nearly invisible to the casual observer, so long as they didn't have thermal imaging or a vigilant watch. Rags stepped to the gunwale and waited while Alan moved the boat into position. Sarah didn't dare turn on her light, but she thought the hull appeared stained with black liquid in one area. But it wasn't M2. She knew all too well what that color was. Dried blood. A rickety wooden ladder had been lashed and secured to the aft hull, probably used to stage ambushes or load up an attack crew. Either way, it made Rags' life considerably easier. She expertly stepped from the Zode onto the platform and immediately froze, her head cocked to one side. After all the firing of automatic weapons and being knocked nearly unconscious several times, Sarah's ears positively screamed with tinnitus. She did her best to ignore the whine of dying nerves and focused on the rhythm of the waves, waiting to hear anything out of step. Nothing. Nothing moved. No lights came to life. No creaks on the hull from booted feet. Nothing but the sound of surface water lapping against the boats before crashing against a rocky wall that rose 5 meters upward from the ocean. The wall wasn't completely flat, though. A jagged piece had utterly collapsed, creating a cave. At least that's what she assumed it was. In the night, it looked like an alien's yawning mouth. Her body tingled with a shiver. That had to be where they'd taken the lifeboat. Did that mean the cave had water in it? That was called something, wasn't it? Sarah shook away the thought and watched Rags sling her rifle over her shoulder and put one hand on the ladder. Rags looked back at Sarah, unmoving as if waiting for something. Finally, Alan raised a hand, held it for a beat, and dropped it. Rags turned back to the ladder and ascended, the stressed wood creaking as it took her mass, and she stopped, waiting, listening. A moment later, she climbed another rung and paused. It took her more than half a minute to reach the gunwale. One hand holding the ladder, she reached into her belt and pulled her pistol. Sarah realized she was holding her breath, and Alan seemed to be as well. Rags pulled herself up one-handed and peered over the gunwale. Sarah expected to hear the rat-a-tat-tat of an AK or the pop of a semi-automatic. Instead, nothing. "Aft deck clear," Rags whispered through the comms. "Salty, time for a little company?" "Copy." He turned to look at Sarah. "You ready to join her?" Sarah slung her rifle and stepped to the Zode's gunwale. Alan goosed the throttle several times to move as close to the platform as possible. When the rib's hull practically touched the platform, Sarah stepped off the gunwale. She landed squarely, but the ship's rocking motion immediately made her waver on her feet. Fighting panic, she tried to match her sway to the ship's. Once sure she had her balance, she reached for the ladder and climbed. Rags had already scrambled over the gunwale and crouched 2 meters further toward the ship's cabin, the dais for the winch rising a full meter in front of her. Sarah crouch-walked away from the gunwale, the hull ticking and creaking with her every step. A glance to port, and she saw the weapons rack. 2 AKs, 3 ARs, and a few pistols. Waterproofed crates of ammunition filled the lowest shelf. The rack had 9 empty slots. 9 rifles were unaccounted for, assuming the rack was fully loaded when the pirates were aboard. Rags held up her right hand in a fist before moving it forward. Sarah nodded and crouch-walked past her and to the right of the winch controls. She kept her rifle pointed at where she thought someone would be if they were in the dais's seat. When she rounded the side of the dais, however, there was no one there. The deck stank of diesel and oil, combined with an odor of rot lying beneath it all. "Provisions gone bad? Maybe some unattended fish?" "You know that smell, boss. Sickly sweet, stomach-turning. It's something much worse." "Shut up, Givens," she told the ghost. But he was right. Only 2 things gave off a scent like that: a rotting corpse and M2. "Rags." "Go," Rags said, her voice as low in volume. "It's here," Sarah said. Rags stiffened. "Sure?" "Yes," Sarah said, rising as high as she dared, eyes poring over the controls. The night vision goggles made discerning shades difficult. Sarah deactivated the night vision and shined her UV light. The stool the winch operator presumably sat upon had no fabric or plastic. It was little more than a tripod, with a warped and canted top, and the metal shone as though it had been fabricated yesterday. "It was definitely here," Sarah said, and reactivated the goggles. "Copy," Rags said softly. "Phosphorus rounds?" Sarah ejected her mag, placed it in her left hip pouch, and pulled a mag from the right side. Sarah ejected her mag, placed it in her left hip pouch, and pulled another from the right side. After carefully sliding it home, cringing at the loud snap it made as it locked into place, she nodded in Rags's direction. Rags did the same, although she managed it without so much as a sound. Sarah would have to ask how she did that, if there was a later. "Cover," Rags whispered into the comms and walked to the cabin hatch. Sarah continued scanning for movement, willing something human to appear, rather than a tentacle or an eye stalk. Cold fingers crept down her back, the icy sensation of fear prickling her skin and vibrating through her thoughts. Sarah gritted her teeth and pushed away the sensation, focusing instead on the shadows surrounding the cabin's port side. 20 minutes until dawn. 20 minutes until the sun chased the night away and blasted the world with M2 killing photons. "The Doi needs a bath," she thought. "A solar shower to wipe away the darkness." Rags reached the open hatch leading to the main cabin and the dark interior. Sarah watched as she stepped across the metal threshold and disappeared inside. When Rags's voice came through the comms, Sarah nearly jumped. "Main cabin clear. Move up." "Copy," Sarah whispered and made her way forward. 7 steps and she was inside. Rags stood at the intersection of 2 bulkheads, her rifle pointing at the ceiling. Smart. At least she'd given herself a little cover. Unlike me. Sarah quickly moved starboard and crouched behind a shallow galley cabinet. The rotten smell was more pungent now, but mixed with a new scent, that of human excrement. Sarah braced herself and purposely nosed the air deeply. The cabin had a stairwell leading down into the hold or engineering, and another group of steps leading to the crew quarters, or so she assumed. She had also assumed she'd walk into a pigsty, but was surprised to see that even the deck looked relatively clean. Maybe their Captain Blackbeard has OCD, she thought. She waited for Rags to move or to say something, but the woman remained frozen in place, her breath all but lost to the sound of the ocean waves. The hull ticked and creaked, and Sarah heard the sound of something like a slipper sliding across a hardwood floor. The sliding stopped. Sarah tightened her grip on the AR and locked her eyes on the stairs leading to the ship's interior. The sound came again, but Sarah still couldn't tell from where. This time it stopped, started again, and fell into an incomprehensible rhythm before disappearing altogether. She caught movement in her peripheral vision and saw Rags waving to her. Rags pointed to the steps and signaled she was moving forward. Not a good idea, she wanted to tell Rags, but that was impossible to do with hand signals. Instead, she tapped the side of her belt where her UV flashlight stuck out. Rags paused for a moment before nodding and slinging her rifle. Once secured, she pulled her pistol and held her UV light below it. She stepped out of cover and into the deep shadows covering the landing. Chapter 34. Rags descended the first few steps, Sarah cringing with each creak and tick the hardwood produced. By the time Rags completely disappeared, Sarah could no longer hear the woman's steps. "Leads to the engine," Rags whispered. A loud cracking and tearing sound rattled the cabin. Sarah tightened her grip on the pistol, wondering if she should switch to her rifle. Silence played out, interrupted only by the whisper of the waves and water lapping at the hull. She wanted to know what had happened, but was afraid to speak for fear of attracting unwelcome attention. "Didn't expect that," Rags said. "My foot broke a floorboard." "Dirt? Stains?" "No," Rags said. "None of that." "Fuck the engine room, get back here," Sarah rasped. Another crunch. "I'll try," Rags said, voice strained with effort. Crunch. Slide, swoosh, slide. "Something's moving," Sarah said as quietly as she could. The sound changed to a vibration that seemed to be right under her. "I think it's in the hold." "Well, shit," Rags said, followed by another crunch. The top of her head was visible over the stair landing. "Wish I'd known that before." The large woman stepped lightly from the wooden landing and gestured to the deck. "Guess it is a little too clean." She looked at Sarah and pointed back out the main cabin hatch. Sarah nodded and holstered both her pistol and the UV light. After double-checking that she had a phosphorus magazine loaded in the AR, she unslung it and held it in the ready position. Rags crouch-walked behind Sarah, her steps only audible from the creaking of the deck. Once outside the cabin, Sarah took up station a meter from the large rectangular deck hatch just in front of the winch dais. Rags approached the hatch and squatted next to it. "I see the manual release," she said. "Guessing this is going to be fucking heavy." "We can use the winch," Sarah said. "Too much noise," Rags said, holstering her weapon and the flashlight. She glanced at Sarah through the balaclava. The sliding sound came again, and the location was undeniable. It was coming from below. "Cover!" "You got it," Sarah whispered. Rags lowered herself to her knees, curled her neoprene-gloved fingers through the latch, and pulled. The heavy hatch groaned, the sound almost loud enough to mask Rags's grunts of effort. It rose a few centimeters, and the large woman shuffled backward as she continued to pull. Sarah, her night vision goggles rendering the world in a greenish haze, peered through the slowly widening crack in the deck. Her mind kept conjuring visions of a nightmarishly black tentacle sweeping out and curling around her middle before dragging her inside the hold with a crackle of frying bacon. Instead, she saw nothing but the thick aluminum sheet that lined the hold. Without lights, and the sun still minutes away from clearing the horizon, it was difficult to see inside. Everything appeared monochrome through the goggles. Sarah swallowed hard as Rags finished pulling the hatch aside. The sliding sound came again, and she held up a fist. Rags responded by pulling her pistol and UV flashlight from her belt. Sarah, not daring to look away from the opening in the deck, said softly, "Anyone home?" Rags crouch-walked to the hatch's edge and peered inside. "Hello?" she called down. The pair waited, each expecting to hear the crackle of eye stalks or other limbs sprouting from a pool of black. Instead, nothing. Rags held up a fist and pointed at Sarah. She nodded and moved her weapon to point at the deck, but remained in place. Rags crouch-walked forward and stepped on a ladder rung. She slowly descended, and Sarah held position, heart hammering, brain waiting to point and shoot or tell her body to run like hell. Rags dropped another rung and then sucked her teeth. "Shit! We got survivors!" Alan snapped awake at Kojo's voice over the radio.
"Salty, come in."
He grabbed the transmitter. "Nest, go."
"We got an update from K&B. You have to get out of there. Over."
Kojo's words tumbled out in a rush, stress in every word. "What's wrong, Nest?" Alan asked, but thought he already knew.
"Thermal barracks coming in 30 minutes.
Kojo said. "Shit. Eric Hooker?"
"No, Salty. The whole fucking island."
Kojo paused as if to catch his breath.
"You need to get back to the ship. Now."
30 minutes seemed like a long time, and maybe it was, but evacuating from this place wasn't guaranteed to be easy. And if Moore had somehow put together what he feared, they'd need to be at least 500 meters away to ensure they weren't flash-fried. "Understood, Salty. I'll update you as soon as I can. Out." He said the last word emphatically enough for Kojo to get the message. Don't bother me unless the world is ending. It was hardly fair since Kojo was an animal and had already lost one friend on this mission, but the last thing Alan needed was for Kojo to be on the radio every 2 minutes, begging them to flee. Thermobarics. Fuel air bombs, napalm, hellfire missiles. K&B had essentially told Kojo they planned on firebombing the entire island, turning every square centimeter of its jungle into an inferno not even M2 could survive. In theory. The boat had drifted starboard, the grotto's mouth coming into view. His jangled nervous system thrummed at the sight, imagining the things that might be inside there, and the thing he somehow knew was inside there. What was it Tolkien had said? Something about the crack of doom? If Alan had ever seen a real-life example, the entrance to the grotto was it. "Shut up," he told himself. "It only looks like that because it's still dark. The sun is coming." Yes, dawn was coming. Yes, things might look less foreboding once the sun was up. And yes, he was practically jumping at shadows. He knew all that, but it didn't make the feeling go away or transform the grotto entrance into something that looked less like an M2 maw. His vision swam for a moment, and a pulse of pain hit the back of his eyelids. Alan cursed in silence and willed his vision to snap back into focus. His eyes obeyed after a moment, and reality righted itself once again. Alan blinked a few times, closed his eyes, and snapped awake when a swell rocked the Zode. He glanced at his watch, saw 3 or 4 minutes had passed, and realized he'd fallen asleep again. "More like passed out," he said to himself, and gripped the wheel hard. When he looked back at the grotto entrance, he realized it looked a little different. The mouth seemed larger and not as jagged. As he watched, the mouth spread apart, streams of darkness rising from the ocean to cover the rocky wall. "Fuck me," Alan whispered to the breeze. The mouth lost its form as the entire cliff face became a solid wall of black. The amalgamation held together for a long moment before the edges began crawling toward the center, collapsing the shape. A few moments later, nothing was left but a jagged crack that looked much more natural than what had been there before. Alan tapped his headset. "Rags, we have—"
"Salty,"
Rags interrupted him.
"We have 2 survivors, a child and a woman."
Alan blinked. "Survivors?"
"Ship appears clear," Sarah said. "We're going to bring them out."
"Be bloody careful," Alan said, choosing not to tell them about the incoming airstrikes. "M2 is in the grotto."
"Copy,"
Rags said after a long pause. Salty had drifted nearly 15 meters away from the ship. Cursing himself, Alan goosed the electric engines and the boat began backing up. He idly glanced up at the sky, once again feeling as though dawn were taking its own sweet damn time in coming. The darkness seemed to mock him. Just before reaching the platform, he looked back at the crack of doom. His tired, concussed mind tried to make sense of what he saw, but it vapor-locked. Through his goggles' green haze, he watched several segmented limbs stick out of the grotto entrance before grabbing the sides of the rock face and pulling a multi-mandible cephalothorax through the gap. The bulbous protrusion had far too many eye clusters, and instead of hair, it had spikes that waved in chaotic motion. It grew wider as though it had been squeezed, and was now released from the pressure. The abdomen followed, 3 more sets of segmented limbs sprouting with a crackle that rose above the surf's persistent noise. Chunks of rock broke free of the crack and splashed into the water as the spiderish thing moved to the side of the wall directly in front of the ship. "Rags! Sarah! M2 at the bow!" The thing flattened its body against the rock, its dozen or so segmented legs coiling simultaneously. Alan knew what came next. He pulled his AR, aimed, and fired. The rifle barked with each shot, the flashes from each report overloading the night vision goggles for the barest of beats before snapping back into focus. The first 2 bullets struck the rock wall, leaving glowing dots of phosphorus. The third, however, didn't miss. One of the spider thing's segmented legs snapped at the second joint, where the bullet connected. The mangled leg fell a full meter before it exploded in a cloud of chitin. The creature leaped from the wall as the barrage of bullets from Alan's rifle pattered against the rock behind it. Alan stopped firing, mouth open, eyes wide. The spider thing flew through the air, its body flipping over so its eyes pointed directly at the ship. It landed on the bow beyond his sightline, with a crash of mass slamming into ancient metal. Alan's mind stuttered for a beat, and then he was shouting over the comms. Rags stood at the bottom of the hold with her pistol and flashlight holstered. Sarah had moved in so that she could see below. There on the metal floor were 2 bundled humans, with thick tape across their mouths and binding their legs and hands. A woman and a boy. They stared at Rags with fear. Sarah didn't fault them for that. Men with guns likely put them here, so why shouldn't they be worried about women with guns? Rags knelt to one knee and ripped a strip of duct tape from the woman's mouth. The captive made a sound close to a yelp and shut her mouth immediately. Smart, Sarah thought.
"We're here to help,"
Rags said, and pulled her knife. Probably not the best thing to say while she unsheathed her blade, based on the woman's wide eyes, but it didn't stop Rags from drawing the sharp blade across the tape. The makeshift bonds around the woman's legs parted with an almost delicate whisper. She pulled the woman into a sitting position and sliced through the tape securing her arms. The woman immediately scrambled to the boy, who looked dehydrated and nearly shrunken into himself. Urine stained his shorts, and the stench of human shit was powerful enough for Sarah to notice it above the lingering scent of M2. The woman kissed the boy, and tears squeezed from his eyes. Rags moved and cut the tape holding the boy's ankles together. Before she could reach for the child's hands, the woman held out her hand and glared at Rags. Rags flipped the knife around and handed it to the former captive. The woman sliced the tape on the boy's hands and quickly turned to Rags, the knife held in a clumsy combat position. Rags stepped backward, hands up. "Not going to hurt you," she said. The woman, her breath little more than ragged pants, didn't drop her arm. Sarah cleared her throat, and the woman instantly looked up. Rather than pointing the rifle at her, Sarah accentuated flexing her fingers on the barrel. It was enough to get the point across. The woman handed the knife back to Rags, hilt first. Rags took it and immediately sheathed it.
"Speak English?"
The woman blinked at her before slowly shaking her head.
"Fucking awesome,"
Rags said.
Rags,
Alan said over the comms.
we have...
Salty,
Rags said.
we have 2 survivors, a child and a woman.
survivors?
Sarah turned to regard the cabin. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed.
Ship appears clear, Sarah said. We're going to bring them out.
Be bloody careful. M2 is in the grotto.
Sarah and Rags exchanged a frantic glance. Sarah's flesh flooded with goose pimples, and Rags clenched her teeth before answering Alan with an emotionless,
Copy.
Rags turned back to the woman, pointed to the ladder, and said something Sarah didn't understand. The woman nodded and lifted her boy, the child beginning to cry from both exhaustion and relief. The woman looked like she would join him, if not for Rags frantically gesturing to the ladder. The woman peeled the boy out of her arms and handed him to Rags. Rags pivoted to put him on the ladder when Alan's voice shouted through the comms.
Rags, Sarah, M2 at the bow.
Sarah swung her head left to look past the cabin into the bow. She saw a shape there, something that...
Fuck!
Sarah yelled and grabbed the hatch.
Stay here!
She slung her AR and pushed the hatch as hard as she could. It slid across the deck with an agonizing squeal. Alan's AR started up, and Sarah wanted to look, but she needed to shut the hatch first. Just as it clicked into place, the ship rocked like something had smashed into the bow, the metal and wood craft dunking its nose beneath the ocean surface for more than a few beats. Unprepared for the jolt, Sarah lost her balance and rolled into the winch dais, her shoulder hitting its edge with a thunk. An explosion of pain radiated outward, making her cry out. The sound, however, was lost to the din of sharp-ended limbs clicking on metal.